clear need to take urgent action to help support survivors who are seeking justice. It also showcases the importance of an intersectional approach to looking at justice for rape survivors to ensure that the system works well for all. But most importantly, this includes challenging the rape myths and the stereotypes that impact how survivors experience the system. Now, today we will be hearing from a number of different panelists outlining the context and the recommendations set out in this report. But before we begin, I'd just like to quickly run through a few housekeeping points. I know that many of you will now be familiar with Zoom, but can I please ask that all attendees put themselves on mute for the duration of the event, and please be aware that this event is being recorded. It would also be helpful if you could all change your names on Zoom to include both your name and the organisation who you're here representing. And it would also be great if you could all introduce yourselves using the Zoom chat function, which I've seen some of you started doing, which is great. You can also use the chat to ask questions throughout the event, which will be collated for the Q&A we're having later on. Can I also suggest that you switch to speaker view for the presentations so you can maximise the output from today's event? I'd also like to just remind you all that we're all aware of the topic that is being discussed today, but it's important to be mindful of the difficult nature of the event's subject matter. I know that EVAW, who are live tweeting the event today, so if you are on social media, please use the hashtag #RapeJusticeNow if you're posting about the event on social media channels. Now, we're going to turn to our first speaker, who is Sarah Green. Panellists, if I could please ask you to briefly introduce yourselves before beginning your presentations, that would be great. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see so many faces and so much attendance here for what we know is a really important subject. So I'm just going to open up actually with the end of the report, so with our recommendations to the government, which is imminently about to produce the first phase of its rape review. I was going to start by saying that women's groups are not exaggerating when we talk about rape having been effectively decriminalised. We understand how provocative that remark is, but I don't know what else you can call a situation where when 55,000 rapes are recorded by the police, those who do report and seek justice face now a 1 in 70 chance of their case being charged. There isn't another term than effective decriminalisation. And within these enormous figures, women and girls and boys and men who report rape face very different barriers. I think we should never look at these numbers without remembering that women from Black and minoritized backgrounds, that women and girls who are disabled, and children of boys and girls face much higher barriers often to being believed in the first place and then to seeking justice and support. And it's critical that our system gets to grips with being able to respond to every survivor and being able to hear disclosure. Rape is inherently hard to prosecute. That's something that all of us who've got a concern for it live with. But women's groups have been concerned that over the past 3 to 4 years, we've seen some really irresponsible behaviour perhaps, and some very worrying changes within the key agency's practice. This is why the End Violence Against Women Coalition, with our lawyers here at CWJ, have brought a judicial review against the CPS, which I don't need to rehearse again today. But we do worry that at a time when more women are seeking justice than ever before, actually the attempts to drop weaker cases and send a signal to police that you won't always get some kinds of more difficult cases charged is extremely worrying and has led to a catastrophic fall in the cases proceeding through the system. So we've got a terrible context to start with. The government has observed this and with good intention initiated a rape review about 18 months ago. So that rape review, whose first phase again is imminent, has done significant examinations. It's made significant inquiries throughout the system, and all of us here are on tenterhooks as to what the first phase will report and recommend, perhaps even by the end of the year. What we would say is that if it doesn't address the collapsed charging and prosecution rate and how that was created, how that could happen, as well as a step change in victim support, then it won't be worth the paper it's written on. And we hope to see some very strong, radical and far-reaching commitments in the rape review when it comes. So to our recommendations, first of all, the women's groups here who've authored the report hope to see some really strong thinking and analysis in the government's rape review. And we hope to see commitments towards really addressing leadership and accountability in the system. We wonder if there's enough kind of expectation and pressure on the senior leaders in the system, those at the very top of the police and the very top of the CPS and those in the courts. We wonder if there is enough pressure on those people such that poor performance is picked up in the way it would be in other sectors and dealt with. We think it's time for looking at a named minister to have overall accountability in this area, and perhaps it's time to look at the governance of the CPS and at parts of the police. PCCs should drive that, but it's a question as to which PCCs do and don't pick this up and make clear what the expectation is to chief constables. Most of all, we need curiosity from these people in very senior positions in the justice system. We need their curiosity about why is this hard to prosecute, but why is it going so wrong? And what are the consequences when many police forces will tell you that they know they have repeat offenders, but they don't have the method, it seems, and the commitment enough to deal with them. When leadership and accountability in the system have been looked at, we then want to see some really dedicated work for the long term on further research, looking at what are the characteristics of those who currently do and do not report, because we can't really understand how the system is working, who it's working for and who it fails, unless we understand who's using it, and we really, really don't. And then we also want to see a good piece of new research commissioned by the government on what women who go through the system actually want from the justice system and want indeed from their whole recovery, because the system tends to treat victims like an instrument or like a simple tool in the prosecution process when they are not. And we dishonour victims at the moment in the way that they can be placed within the whole system. Moving on from there, so from good work on leadership and on further research and understanding the problems, we want to see some really significant long-term investment in whole workforce reform throughout the CPS and the police. We want to see police investigators and CPS case builders get back to building cases on their merits. And we believe the way to do that is to really invest in these jobs being career specialisms, being roles that people are recruited into, are developed in, and have really strong supervision around so that they don't burn out. And we think it's time for some really radical thinking and in our courts and in the way that we allow rape cases to be tried. Some of the victims and survivors who are quoted in our report talk about being re-traumatized by the system and being harmed again within it. So we think it's time to look at a sexual history evidence ban that is fit for the digital age, because what we have isn't working. We also need to look at extending the piloting of legal advocates for victims, because they are treated with fewer rights and with less protection than defendants in court. We also think it's time to look at juries and how they do and do not serve the interests of justice in rape cases. We don't fall down on either side at the moment, but certainly we need to be allowed to ask the question, and we recommend a special commission on juries. And perhaps it might also look at whether a more inquisitorial approach could be used in rape trials than this adversarial approach, which creates really an incentive to go at the victim's credibility in court. And finally, of course, women's organisations are most concerned to see reform and much better sustainable investment and commitment to victims' support services. We need guaranteed wraparound support and strong advocacy for every woman and man who ever reports. And this shouldn't be in a one-size-fits-all state. So, for example, the groups around the country who work with Black and minoritized women really know what women from different communities need. They provide an enormous amount of support already to those who seek justice, perhaps by reporting in the system, but that kind of expertise and specialism is not always recognised. So we'd make a plea for wraparound support, and that not being seen as some kind of separate channel from getting the best out of the justice system for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I would now like to bring in Kat, who is a rape survivor and campaigner, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kat Arignello. I'm a rape survivor. I'm also an activist and campaigner in ending violence against women and girls. And I wanted to share my story with you. 3 years ago, I was attacked by a man I just started dating. I was held against my will, tied up, beaten and raped at knife point. I didn't know at the time, but this man had a history of violence and convictions for assaulting previous partners. He was also on licence that I didn't know, having just been released from prison. I didn't report what happened straight away. I waited 2 days, something that would be questioned by the CPS. I was told by police at the time of reporting and later by my investigating officer that the perpetrator was known to them. He was arrested and charged with 7 offences for the attack on me, including 3 charges of rape. The police were amazing throughout, and there was no doubt in their minds he was going to be found guilty and he would go to prison for a long time. I was constantly told this was a strong case. I received a phone call literally days before the trial date. This was from my investigating officer. She told me the CPS were thinking of dropping the case. I needed to be free the next day to attend a meeting at their office. She was in tears, and actually she was the only person who showed any emotion throughout this process in the system. And she was actually the only one that really had any drive to try and convict this dangerous man. And this meeting would be my first encounter with the CPS. My experience at that meeting with the senior ASO lawyer will just never leave me, and to this day takes me to a very dark place. Her conduct re-traumatised me and left me a wreck. That evening, I met up with friends to drown my sorrows, and on the way home, I really did consider taking my own life. The pain I felt after having seen the CPS was excruciating. The way they had left me, I felt empty, hopeless, humiliated and discarded. The exact same feelings my rapist left me with. She was cold from the start. She made it clear she didn't want to be there. I learned later she actually didn't want to hold that meeting with me, but my investigating officer insisted that that meeting went ahead. She opened the meeting with, well, what questions have you got? What do you want to know? She never once acknowledged what had happened to me or asked me at any point if I was okay to be there. She didn't treat me with the dignity I deserved, and she certainly didn't treat me as somebody who was highly traumatised. I'll never forget my response, and to this day, I still don't know how I found it in me to seize control back in that meeting room. I replied with, no, you're here to explain why you're dropping my case, and then I'll let you know what questions I have. She went on to say that she'd saved me from being put on the witness stand and being ripped apart. She said the jury wouldn't believe me. Now I can say that I found her tone patronising, but at the time I was in shock and trauma. She said it was a case of his word against mine, yet it was so easy to prove that he was a liar, given that one of those charges was impersonating a police officer, and a friend of his came forward to give evidence for the prosecution confirming this. Subsequent meetings with the CPS were along the same vein. There was just no understanding of trauma. When I asked, they couldn't give me a single example of a trauma response. It was clear they were out of their depth and making huge decisions without the proper knowledge or training. To put me off, they just kept throwing legal jargon at me, which confused me as I didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't know about custody time limits or what that meant in my case. What I really needed at that meeting was someone who could represent me, represent my best interests, and who had the legal expertise. I needed legal representation. It was clear the CPS had no appetite or drive to put my case to trial. They weren't interested that this was a dangerous man who would, without doubt, re-offend given his history. When I asked the lawyer if she understood that her actions meant there was a threat to the safety of other women in releasing a known rapist, she simply shrugged and said, I've heard worse. At a follow-up meeting, the acting head said he believed me. This was the first time the CPS acknowledged what had happened to me. I was just about to feel slightly better when he added that if he didn't believe me, he would be pressing charges against me for false accusation. He got that tone so wrong. I was told, forget about it, get on with the rest of your life. I believe it was kindly meant, but I was deeply insulted. I later found out that the police had formally appealed to the CPS decision. So why didn't CPS feel as certain about this as everybody else, me, the police? If I was prepared to go on trial, why weren't they willing to try? I believe so much needs to fundamentally and drastically change within the system. At the point of reporting, I want all victims and survivors to be provided with legal representation. Rape isn't investigated like other crimes. For example, I don't believe that a victim of a mugging has to give up their entire medical records and personal data as part of the investigation. I want all victims and survivors to be given wraparound care and access to therapy pre-trial and post-reporting, whether that case makes it to court or not. I literally went from daily contact with my investigating officer to being dropped off a cliff at a time when I was at my lowest. When a case is NFA'd, victims and survivors can feel the most vulnerable and in need of help. I want training in understanding victim blaming and trauma for juries, judges, and RASO lawyers. If the RASO lawyers in my case couldn't understand my traumatised mind and actions, what hope do we have of a jury understanding them? And I do question whether juries are fit for purpose in rape trials. I want the CPS to do their job, which is building cases, not tearing them down. Like any other leading organisation or profession, the CPS needs to be held accountable by an independent regulating body. Our country's leaders have allowed rape convictions to plummet with no recourse for this. If this was a professional company, the legislators would be all over the failures. There would be governance in place with independent bodies examining whether professional standards had been met. They would be speaking to users of this service for their experience and input, and they would be looking into the failures and impact on lives, and there would be appropriate compensation. Interestingly, Seeker paid out the full compensation to me for my attack, which I know isn't usual, so somebody believe me. I was able to access trauma therapy through my employer's private healthcare. I know I'm one of the lucky ones. I've been in therapy now for 3 years, and I would not be here speaking to you without it. Timely therapy shouldn't be an exception. It should be the norm and offered without question. It shouldn't be a lottery as to whether you can afford it or whether you work for an employer who will fund it. So now I use my experience and my voice to raise awareness to sexual violence. I created and I chair a forum for people who do similar jobs to me, people managers, activists, professionals, all with the same goal of supporting people in the workplace who have been affected by domestic abuse and sexual violence. Whilst our government refuses to improve its response, then maybe, just maybe, I can influence more employers to support their people. I'm going to leave a quote that I found over the weekend. Often, it isn't the initiating trauma that causes seemingly insurmountable pain, but the lack of support after. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kat, for your brave, honest and powerful testimony and for sharing that with us today. I'd now like to bring in, quite timely, Kit Malthouse, who is the Minister for Crime and Policing, to respond to today's report.
Well, thanks very much. It's obviously hard to know how to follow that. And Kat, I'm very sorry to hear about your experience. I hope that the work we do over the next few years together will make you feel that what you went through is less likely to occur. But nevertheless, obviously your experience has been a difficult and traumatic one. But nevertheless, I'm pleased, I guess, that you're trying to turn it into something positive. And I heard what you said. It's landed, and we will do our best to try and live up to the challenges that you've posed to us. And of course, it's a great sadness, particularly for me, that we are where we are. 10 years ago, when I was at City Hall as Deputy Mayor for Policing, we did extensive work in the area of particularly rape crisis and rape support to try and improve the detection and indeed the prevention of rape across the capital, with, I hope, some success. And I worked with a number of the organisations represented on this call today in doing that. So coming into this job, whatever it was 18 months ago, it seemed particularly tragic and sad to me that we got to the situation where the numbers were so appallingly low and where so many survivors and victims felt that they weren't getting the justice they deserved, or even the response from the system that they deserved. And so setting about the work that we've hopefully will come to a conclusion soon seemed to us vital for confidence in the system. And I wanted to join you for your launch today, really for 3 reasons. First of all, to say thank you to those of you who participated in the rape review that the government's been undertaking. You've all been, many of you have been on our reference group, offering advice and evidence and research, all of which has been very gratefully received, along with the work of the Victims Commissioner. And we hope to be able to publish the review shortly. I know that's a bit of an indeterminate word, but you'll understand that in getting this stuff out, we have to seek collective agreement and then find what they call grid slots, I think they call it, to be able to get it out. But you have our commitment that we want it out as quickly as we can now, definitely this side of Christmas, so that we can get on with this important work. So thank you for that. I also ought to, at this point, say thank you to many of you for your work during the COVID crisis. Obviously, the issues with the criminal justice system and policing, the strain on the system generally, meant that we had to work at speed to scale up support for victims and survivors, to make sure that they got what they needed from us during the crisis. And many of you helped with that. And I know you're going to help ongoing, not least because the natural backlog in the courts is going to cause challenges for us as we try to bring these kind of cases to some sort of justice. They already have significant delay in coming to court, and the natural effect of the courts being closed for a while because of the pandemic means that that's going to be exacerbated, notwithstanding the fact that the court service and the judiciary are working hard to get on top of the backlog. It's nevertheless going to be critical that we work together to provide the support required to help victims and survivors make their way or get into court in the first place, rather than fall by the wayside purely by the operation of time and the stress and trauma that's associated with that. So thank you for your work so far and for the work you'll do in the future. And then the third reason was to welcome your report. I've had a look at the broad conclusions in the executive summary, and it looks like a really valuable piece of work. We obviously can't comment on the conclusions because we've got our own review coming quite soon. But it shot through with what Sarah quite rightly put her finger on, which is what I'm hoping that the rape review will also exhibit, which is that word curiosity. While obviously we're dealing with a very traumatic and difficult crime type, and one that is incredibly sensitive, we do have a duty more than empathizing and supporting victims to be curious in a sort of wall-eyed way about what fundamentally is going wrong in the system. Where are the pinch points? Where is the attrition occurring? Why are we failing to get a sufficient number of cases into the courtroom where justice can take its course, notwithstanding what may then happen in the courtroom? And these are the questions that over the last 18 months or so, we've been trying to answer, and which I, as the minister with responsibility at the MOJ and with other ministers, have been pressing officials to try and get some answers. And of course, as you will know, this is a complicated area, and our research has found that there are a combination of factors that can have a significant impact on how the cases progress through the system. The effectiveness of how different parts of the system work together, the quality of decisions made in the progression of cases, how victims experience the process, the way complex digital evidence from devices such as smartphones are handled and used, and the impact that has upon victims and their perception of what's going to happen to them during the process. All of these are concerns that we need to address to make sure that there's an effective system from start to finish. We can't allow these cases, sensitive and difficult though they are, to be put in the just too difficult box. We have to make sure that victims and survivors feel that their cases are being treated as genuine, that their version of events is genuine, and that they are treated with respect. If we don't give victims this confidence that they're going to be treated in a way that's acceptable, then we will fall at the first hurdle. Our aim is to have a system and the people within it that can deliver a confident, specialized, and empathetic response to this particular offense type. And I hope that when the review is published, that you'll see that exhibited throughout. Our immediate action from it will deal, I hope, with many of the areas that are coming out of your report, specifically getting best evidence while ensuring proportionate disclosure by victims of their personal data, that the police and the CPS look at their ways of working and the role of specialism, and that we make sure we have the right support for victims throughout the criminal justice system and improve the experience of people going through that system, particularly of going to court for victims and for all others involved in supporting and helping those victims. Now, an important part of an effective system is, of course, the support, making sure that all victims can access that and that they get the information they need. And hopefully you saw in the spending review that a total of £40 million is going to be provided for victims and the support services, including continuing to provide 15 million next year to fulfill our manifesto commitment to increase support for victims of sexual violence and rape, including some funding for new ISVAs, as I say, specifically to support people through the criminal justice system. As well as this, we're going to be putting another £25 million into victims' support services, recognising, I guess, the negative impact that COVID is going to have on some of those victims that I talked about earlier. The other thing, just to say finally, is two things. First of all, I'm very much aware that the publication of the review, and indeed of your report today, is just the start. It's not the end of the process. We can't leave it on the shelf. As we plough our way through the work programs that will come from it, we have to maintain Sarah's implication to be curious, to look for the lessons it teaches us as we go and to trim ourselves accordingly. Our overarching objective to get an increasing number of cases into the courtroom in the first place, where justice can then take its course. And we're going to need your help as we make that the start on that journey. It's going to be sometimes a difficult and contentious journey. We won't always agree, but I hope that we will show through the work that we're doing that we share an objective, which is to get more justice for more people who've been subjected to this awful crime. And then finally, on your point about political leadership, I think this is absolutely critical, that there is a key and clear accountability framework, and for better or worse, until they decide to fire me, it's going to be me at the Ministry of Justice leading on the review, determined as I am to drive it forward to delivery. And I will give you my undertaking to be as transparent as the rules allow me in our effectiveness and our progress on that. And I'll be working hand in hand with Victoria Atkins at the Home Office, who I know is known to many of you from the work she's done over the last couple of years. It's extremely important that we have good and assertive strategic leadership. Happily, both Victoria and I have some experience in the sector from the past, but hopefully, and this almost most valuably, we'll be able to build really strong relationships with all of you as we set about this journey. We are determined to see really quantum change over the next few years in the way we deal with this crime type. We owe it to the system to make sure that it's inspiring confidence, but most of all, we owe it to the victims and survivors who are currently leaving too often feeling that justice has not been done. That, I'm afraid, has to change, and we will do our best to make it so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for your response. And I think you can be assured that the parliamentarians on this Zoom today from both houses, from all parties, will be holding your feet to the fire on your words today. And we eagerly anticipate the government's review in due course. I'd now like to bring in Harriet Wistrich, the Director from Centre for Women's Justice, please.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Okay.
Harriet.
Yes, so if we can move on to this next slide, I'm going to just give you a bit of an overview of some of the content of the report. The way the report was produced between the four organisations was to look at a number of different areas, including the law, how it's changed, what's going wrong with the law, as well as the experience of survivors and victims, which we'll hear about and we have heard about, and you know, an overall picture. So we have a number of graphs and statistics in the report which set out you know, where things are going wrong, and concluding with the recommendations which you've already heard from Sarah. And those recommendations were evolved through a roundtable discussion with a whole group of experts, people really working very much in detail around the issues of rape, to try and come up with some ideas about something that we could go forward with. Sarah's explained the reasons behind the report, and as well as the government's review. We're also in the midst of judicial review proceedings against the Director of Public Prosecutions, challenging what their responsibility, we have evidence to suggest, for the recent collapses in the prosecution of rape. You could go on to the next slide. I wanted to start really by saying, you know, it may feel like we've been here before, and people who've been around for a while will feel like we're constantly kind of reviewing rape, looking at what's going wrong, thinking about what can be improved. In the slide there, I've listed a number of really important changes over the years which have been designed to try and, you know, improve the criminalisation of rape. You know, starting, for example, with making rape in marriage actually a crime, which it wasn't before, introducing anonymity, which is regarded as critical to enable victims to come forward, a limitation on the cross-examination of previous sexual history, introduction of special measures, a redefinition of consent in the Sexual Offences Act, and a whole range of other measures in that codifying piece of legislation. The mandatory guidance on rape myths and stereotypes, which is designed really to remove us from essentially a rape myth culture that we live in, where all sorts of presumptions are made about why a woman gets raped and why a man rapes, which we're constantly having to battle, and which unfortunately are ever present in the system now. In the around 2013, the CPS introduced a merits-based approach, a guidance basically, on how to ensure that prosecutors were making decisions based purely on the objective merits of the case, not decisions infected by rape myths and stereotypes. And this removal of the merits-based approach from 2017 onwards, we say, as part of the problem which has caused the collapse in rape prosecutions. We also had the introduction of a victim's right of review, recognition of human rights legal obligations to investigate and prosecute rape. So there are a whole range of different things that have changed. If we move on to the next slide. However, despite all that, we're still seeing problems, and we see backlashes coming up where something happens which affects perhaps the rights of suspects, and changes are brought around which mean we are going backwards in terms of the benefits that have been brought in. So, for example, the presumption of belief, which was something that those working with rape victims fought really hard to say, this doesn't mean you must believe and automatically believe forevermore anything that a rape complainant says when she comes forward to report. But you have to start by assuming that she's come forward to report because she has been raped, and encourage somebody to come forward and speak. Obviously, if the evidence arises subsequently that was a false allegation, we know false allegations are extremely rare, then that presumption can be removed. But we've seen, following the notorious case of Nick Carl Beach, that Judge Henriquez produced a report saying we have to stop doing that. But we say that's not the right approach because of one case that went wrong. Of course, austerity has hit the criminal justice system across the board, from police, prosecution, the court system, and that inevitably has impacted on the effectiveness of the system. We've seen a whole range of problems in relation to police investigation and decision making. Within the report, we've produced a summary of, for example, of a study we've done into the failure to prosecute, to investigate cases because of an assumption that if a rape isn't corroborated, then it's not going to pass pass the test, and that's not necessarily the case. And so there's a kind of an abandonment of a willingness to really build evidence and build cases. And we've seen, of course, following the Liam Allen case, that there was a swing towards downloading every single piece of digital data, and that went too far, and we're fortunately kind of stepping back from that and looking only at reasonable lines of inquiry. But the disproportionate demands for disclosure have really had an impact on delay, because huge quantities of everybody's mobile phone data are being poured over unnecessarily in many cases, which has caused huge delay to the system. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, the change in policy approach we believe that CPS have taken by removing the merits-based approach, and that's the subject of a judicial review which is due to be heard in the Court of Appeal in January. So that's a bit of an overview. We've set that out in a much more detail in our report, which please do read, and I'm sure it's been shared. The link to the report shared in the chat and available from EVAW and the other organisations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harriet. I'd now like to bring in Samantha Roy, who's the Head of Research, Evaluation and Development from Imkaan, and Amelia Handy, the Policy Officer for Rape Crisis England and Wales. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. Sorry about the lag. My name's Amelia Handy. I am the Policy Officer at Rape Crisis England and Wales. I'm co-presenting today with Samantha Roy from Imkaan, Head of Research. I'll just start by thanking Kat. A lot of what we'll talk about, and we'll draw out the themes in her testimony, which she so courageously shared with us. So the section that we co-wrote, we're speaking about now, focuses on victim and survivors' experience of the criminal justice system. We maintain for most survivors, overwhelmingly, it is traumatizing, it is demoralizing, but which survivors will experience in a variety of different ways according to their age, sex, class, race, sexuality, and ability. We used in this a wide variety of sources for this chapter, including surveys, primary research from our member centres, many of which have been established for decades, as well as secondary sources and previous reports. I would just especially like to thank Dr. Olivia Smith, who shared her yet to be published data with us so that we could provide it within this report. Over to Samantha, next slide, please.
Thanks, Amelia. As Kat powerfully, I think we need the next slide, please. Thank you. As Kat powerfully highlighted earlier, we need to recognise that justice isn't delivered for the vast majority of victim survivors through the criminal justice system. So if you look at the ONS data, it shows you that 17% of victim survivors of sexual violence and abuse report to the police. We also know that for some, the prospects of justice are even less likely because of the structural inequalities within the criminal justice system. So if you're from a Black and minoritized community, older, younger, disabled, LGBT plus community, you're more likely to withdraw. from prosecution, you're less likely to have your case proceed to prosecution. There have been many previous reports and reviews, as my other co-presenters have highlighted, that have been commissioned, which continue to highlight these gaps. And for many of us in the sector, it's not new knowledge, but a critical question remains: have the decision makers, leaders, done enough to understand how and why institutional racism, sexism, disableism, and other forms of discrimination manifests within the criminal justice system to address barriers and make meaningful changes? Or do we continue to ignore the views of the vast majority of victim survivors who experience multiple intersecting barriers to justice? Have we done enough to consider what justice should look like beyond the court system? So within the report, there are lots of questions there for senior leaders and decision makers within the criminal justice system. Can I have the next slide, please? Unfortunately, this criminal justice system continues to be a site of harm for many survivors. Rape myths and stereotypes, definitions of rape, who perpetrates rape and why, continue to play a key role in how survivors are treated by criminal justice agencies, and still has a very significant impact on criminal justice outcomes. Myths and stereotypes, despite the guidance that Harriet mentioned, are deeply entrenched within the system. We know that there are a number of procedural issues as well, which has a real impact in terms of how the criminal justice system operates. So women are left in limbo, dealing with further stress and trauma as their normal lives are suspended for indefinite periods of time, sometimes up to 2 years, and are told they can't access pre-trial therapy if their cases are open, despite this being a critical lifeline and, importantly, often mitigating against the trauma that's reproduced by the criminal justice system itself. I'm going to hand over to Amelia now.
Yeah, so continuing as the criminal justice system as a site of harm, what is really fundamental is, as Shimanta just mentioned, the heavy usage of myths and stereotypes, which we maintain are institutional, because criminal justice agencies are aware of the biases held by juries. They understand these as problematic, yet they actually end up reifying those very same myths and stereotypes through preempting them, and then the police responding to the CPS preemption. In one of the dossier cases for the judicial review held by EVAW and CWJ, a survivor received a victim blaming letter for the CPS, stating that she should have locked her own bedroom door in order to prevent the rape. Myths and stereotypes are institutional in that ways through which cross-examination takes place, designed to undermine the survivor's credibility, is actually inherent to the adversarial court system, which is utterly traumatizing and totally not fit for purpose for RASO cases. Myths and stereotypes play out differently for different survivors, like young child survivors, disabled survivors, and those with learning difficulties are seen to be inherently unreliable as witnesses. Conversely, a perpetrator with learning difficulties, as well as young male perpetrators, are seen as somehow less accountable. A woman from a minority ethnic community, such as women from the Irish traveller community, or from a faith community, such as Muslim women, are told that somehow it's normal in your culture for your husband or for men to do these things. Next slide, please. So what the above leads to is large-scale demoralisation in the sector, not just from survivors, but also with frontline workers. There is a fairly well-documented demoralisation within the police forces, whose investigations so rarely meet the CPS's thresholds, but we have particularly focused in the report on frontline rape crisis workers and ISVAs and by and for advocates, who day in, day out have to deliver the cripplingly bad news to survivors. ISVAs and advocates share that they feel there is a real tension in terms of their work and their integrity in having a role and a job essentially to support women through this system that they know is failing and is often harmful. The exceptional women who do support these survivors experience vicarious trauma, burnout, and ever-growing caseloads. The ISVA quote above just shows how systemic victim blaming has led her to not have a single case go to court in a whole 4-year period. And I would just add that the role of the ISVA was formed in order to support women to court. Next slide, please.
Because of all the reasons that we've highlighted and other speakers have, we make really strong recommendations about specialist wraparound support at an early stage for every survivor. This is critical. It mustn't be predicated on police reporting. And we feel very strongly that it shouldn't be delivered through systems that have been experienced as harmful or discriminatory. So, for example, that might be helplines run by criminal justice agencies or based within police stations. We feel that wraparound specialist support is essential, and there needs to be more recognition of non-statutory pathways and non-medicalised models of therapeutic support. Specialist and independent sexual violence support through rape crisis centres and services led by and for the communities they serve are highly valued by survivors. We have so much evidence, and this is so well documented, and this really creates that space of trust, healing and transformation. What we're clear about is that we really, really need much more sustainable support pathways for all survivors. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. I'd now like to bring in Ellie Reeves, please, who is the Labour Shadow Solicitor General.
Sorry, I was having problems unmuting myself. Hopefully people can hear me now. So I'm sorry about that. Thank you, brilliant. Thanks very much, Alex. Thank you first of all, thank you to all of the organisations involved in the writing of this report and for organising today's incredibly important panel discussion, and thank you also to Kat for sharing her very powerful testimony. I imagine it wasn't an easy thing to do, and I'm very grateful that you shared what happened to you, Kat, and I think that we can all learn from the dreadful experience that you had when you bravely came forward. The report is incredibly important, but also makes for pretty grim reading, that victims of rape are, it is clear, being let down at every level. You know, we all know, we've all read, we've all heard about what's happening in the CPS. We know that prosecution rates for rape and serious sexual violence are at the lowest level ever. And last week we also learned that domestic abuse prosecutions have also dropped by 19% this year. So clearly something is going very wrong in relation to rape, serious sexual violence, and now it seems domestic abuse as well. And it's not just this issue around CPS failing to charge cases, but also there are issues around how victims are treated by the criminal justice system, and Kat talked very powerfully about that. We know from the latest CPS inspection report that there has been a stark deterioration in the quality of communications to rape victims from the CPS. Only 19% of RASO letters are of the right quality, just 19% letters are of the right quality, and 42% of letters from the CPS to victims are lacking in empathy. And the report found there'd been no improvement in victim communication since 2018. It's something that I've raised with the CPS when I've spoken to them. It's incredibly important that prosecutors get this right, and that the quality of their work and the empathy towards victims is there, and it's clear that that is currently lacking across the piece. And without it, people won't have confidence in the criminal justice system. The report from the Victims Commissioner, Dame Vera Baird, found that only 1 in 7 rape survivors feel that they have any hope of receiving justice. And I think that really illustrates the crisis in the system at the moment. That change is desperately needed. I think the report makes some really powerful recommendations. One of the things that I think is really important is this looking at this work being a specialism within the CPS. Quite frankly, I find it quite concerning that it isn't a specialism already. I was a lawyer for many years before entering into Parliament. Never criminal law. I was an employment rights lawyer, but I specialised in a particular area of law, and within that area of law, I had particular specialisms. I specialised in discrimination work. The idea that you don't already have these specialisms within the CPS, I find quite difficult to get my head around, actually. So I'd say that is something that urgently needs to happen. You've got to have people do this work that feel passionate about it, and that really want to drive forward change in this area. And that's not to say that all CPS lawyers are doing a bad job. I'm sure they're not, but you've got to have people there that are passionate about this work and want to make a change and recognise that there are currently failings in the system and want to be part of something which reverses that. So I think that's really, really important. And when the government do finally publish the very long-awaited end-to-end rape review, I really hope, and I really feel it must, include recommendations for tackling prosecution levels within the CPS. I don't think that this huge decline in prosecutions can be explained away easily, either by the CPS or by this government. And I think that review has got to tackle this head on. I'm also concerned that the CPS haven't yet published their RASO 2025 report, but also I have to say, given that there is clearly currently a crisis, it seems to me that waiting to 2025 isn't the right way forward. Actually, this needs to be a review that looks to seek urgent change, not a 5-year plan. I appreciate that change can take a while, but a 5-year plan, given the crisis that we're currently facing, doesn't seem good enough to me. I think we need urgent action on all of this. I also felt that the report put forward some really powerful recommendations on leadership and accountability. And one thing that could be introduced almost immediately is politicians, the Prime Minister, cabinet colleagues, speaking about the issue of rape and serious sexual violence on a much more frequent basis. You know, we've had the launch of the 16 days of action against gender-based violence, and you know, the Prime Minister wore his white ribbon last week, and of course that's welcome, but what we need is senior politicians talking about these issues all of the time, not just because we're having 16 days of action, but because it's important to keep this issue up the agenda. And I think if you have senior politicians speaking out about this on a much more regular basis and using their public platform to do so, you end some of the stigma, you end some of the stereotypes, and you put it much more up the political agenda than frankly it currently is. So I would like to see senior politicians doing that. Let's end some of the taboo and the whispering and all of those things, and let's move it up the agenda. And that will give victims as well confidence to come forward. Ministerial oversight is really key for all of this. And I really think we do need to have a named minister responsible for this, dedicated. You know, we know that there's a crisis. We've seen that. We know that. We need a dedicated minister overseeing all of this and driving change going forward, overseeing the data, making sure that change happens. Someone that can be held to account if we don't see rapid improvement in the statistics. Not just the prosecution rates, but also this issue around letters not being empathetic, victims not having confidence in the system, all of those issues. And I think we only get that accountability if we have a named minister that's responsible for those things, that people can meet with, that organisations know they're the go-to person to get this done. So look, I think that there is a huge amount that needs to be done. It needs to be done cross-government. It needs engagement, more engagement than there is at present, I'm afraid, from senior government politicians, the cabinet and the Prime Minister downwards. And I think that is incredibly important. There needs to be as well, in my view, more support and investment going into the CPS and also to organisations that support victims of rape and sexual violence, giving them the support that they need as well. Organisations that many of you in this discussion today are involved in are absolutely key in supporting victims, and you can't do it without funding and resource. So, I think that's an incredibly important part of this puzzle as well. So I will end how I started, which is by saying thank you to everyone that's been involved in this report. I feel conscious that it shouldn't just be 16 days of action every year. It should be an ongoing. It should be an ongoing dialogue every day of the year, because that's the only way we will get real change. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Ellie. Completely agree with you on that. I'd now like to bring in Wera Hobhouse, the Liberal Democrat Justice and Women Inequality spokesperson. Wera, over to you. It's a bit like a seance, isn't it?
Thank you.
Like, are you there? Talk to us. There she is.
Thank you very much. And I'm so sorry I had to leave this very, very important meeting for about 15 minutes because I was asking a question on disability employment discrimination, which was very important to me. So I do apologize. It wasn't for any lack of respect for you and your organization, and particularly Kat. I did hear your powerful and very courageous testimony. And we all know how, unless we hear this from victims and survivors, we will not make any progress. Your absolutely terrible account of how victims and survivors are being disbelieved is just the most shameful thing that still exists amongst us, and we really, really need to make a difference here. And unfortunately, I had to nip out when the minister was replying, so I don't know what he said, but hopefully he has an open ear to see to make sure that we do make changes. But let me just talk from my experience and where I'm coming from politically. So I've become the chair of the APPG against childhood trauma, and through that I have understood a lot around trauma and trauma-informed services. But trauma is something that happens throughout our lives, and unless people understand trauma and our services understand trauma, I don't think we can actually respond accurately, particularly also around the time it takes to recover. And therefore, my biggest concern is that unless everybody who is working in the criminal justice system, and that includes the police, actually understands trauma, then we will not make that progress. So the recommendations in the report around we need a complete radical rethink around how juries actually get trained, how the people are being trained that first respond to victims of rape and sexual violence. I think that's really where I believe we need to start, and where the report is very powerful. And that, of course, then includes, we need properly resourced services, as Ellie has already said. Unless we actually put proper resources behind these services, we will not make any progress. Now, incidentally, I've been asking for many months the government to ratify the Istanbul Convention, and maybe unsurprisingly or not, the government has refused to do that. And the reason for that is that, as I understand, the Istanbul Convention basically mandates for any governments signing up to that a certain number of rape centers and rape services across the country. While the government says we do actually invest in these services, they don't invest in anywhere near the right amount to what is actually required of governments and countries that sign up to the Istanbul Convention. So I will continue to press the government to actually or ratify, they've signed up but not ratify, ratify the convention, because that only guarantees us the proper funding and the proper number of rape support services and victim services that we need. So the other thing that is absolutely vital is that we understand that services don't, one size doesn't fit all. So clearly there are very different experiences and very different needs from communities of Black and ethnic minority groups. There is very different needs from LGBT groups. They're very different groups. And again, one horrible finding about, how, if you're a person with a disability, the rate of disbelief goes even further down, as I understand it. Again, a shameful finding that we need to reverse and draw attention to. And again, as has been said here today before, we need to talk about this. And we need to talk about it a lot more. We need to call on the government to take this seriously and have, as has already been said as well, and the report recommends, we need a named minister for this. We won't make any real progress unless all the recommendations of the report are being seen through. And I want to come back to what Kat said at the end of her testimony, that she felt, as horrible and awful and traumatizing the actual event was, what was even worse was the response to her afterwards. And that cannot last, that must change. I'm committed to help and support you in any shape or form I can, and welcome to your report and all the work you're doing.
Thank you. Sorry, I was on mute because we had the bell going off. Thank you, Wera. Now, thank you to all of our speakers for today. I'd now like to bring us onto the Q&A section of the event, and we'll begin with questions which will be prepared by the Victims Commissioner, Wera Baird, please. Oh, Dame Wera, you're on mute. Hang on a moment. Oh, can somebody unmute Dame Wera? There we are. Thank you.
Hi, how's that? Sorry,
Perfect.
were you asking me to lead the questions or make some comments?
Just comments, please. Yes, if you would, it would be great to hear from you.
Thanks. That's it. Firstly, let me congratulate the authors of this report on a terrific piece of work, and let me congratulate them too on delivering it ahead of the publication of the End-to-End Rape Review's interim report, so that it can be taken on by the End-to-End Rape Review and its proposals and its recommendations absorbed into the results of that process. It is, I'm afraid, a little bit of an indicator to me that the sector does not have a great deal of confidence in the End-to-End Rape Review, that it felt it needs a report of its own. And I would thank Kit Malthouse for coming along and hotly recommend to him that the way to restore any lack of confidence that might be represented by the need to deliver this additional, if you like, thorough look and thorough set of recommendations, the way to deal with it is indeed to look again at the End-to-End Rape Review and take, if all of this party's recommendations are not absorbed into the End-to-End Rape Review, we will wonder why we and many stakeholders have worked quite hard to try to ensure that it did acknowledge the problems and it did provide some solutions. In particular, a number of people have commented, and let me very much second and affirm, that if it does not take on the catastrophic change in prosecution approach by the CPS, abolishing the merits-based approach, and the immediate collapse that led to, which shows that after a decade of charging well over 3,000 cases a year, the change abolishing the merits-based approach happened, and within 2 years, 3,671 charges in a year collapsed to 1,800 charges 2 years later, with no significant reduction in referrals from the police until right at the end of the second year, when, as I think the police have made public themselves now, police were starting to say, why are we referring cases? Because there is a very limited number of them and a very limited character of them that gets through. But until that time, there was no cut in police referrals, and the CPS decisions have plainly driven what Sarah's called, and we've all echoed at various times, the decriminalisation of rape, by taking that decision, which I'm sure they didn't intend to have the catastrophic effects it's had. But until that's acknowledged, and it needs to be acknowledged in the end-to-end rape review, we will not see the problem, and therefore we won't be able to formulate a solution that a lot of people have pulled together here. And as everyone rightly says, the end-to-end rape review report will not be worth the paper it's written on if it doesn't tackle that. It also raises the separate, but obviously very related point of accountability of the Crown Prosecution Service, since this all happened in 2017. And this sector and the Centre for Women's Justice and I and many others have been saying ever since that it needed to be reversed, and nothing has happened to reverse it. And that says to me, where is the accountability of this state body which chooses not to prosecute certain cases, and as a consequence of that error, fails to prosecute to the extent that we are seeing? So I would thank Kit Malthouse for coming and hope that he can take that message fairly away, and that the haste to get now a product, I understand, out of the end-to-end rape review is suborned to the need to ensure that the problems that have been set out clearly here today are properly attacked and properly resolved by it. So I want, in particular, before I stop, to thank Kat for her amazing courage and the clarity and analysis which she applied to the way she was treated. Kat, we are all with you. This was not justice. And I, as the Victims Commissioner, work regularly, and I'm privileged to do so with the great organisations who represent people from this sector and who have drawn together this report. And I say to the government, listen to Kat, listen to all of us, don't look somewhere else, look here, you will see the problem and you will readily come to the solution. And I would just like to affirm that as the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, I am worried and hugely concerned for the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women now since 2017 who have not had the opportunity of justice because there has been no charge and no prosecution. And I will work tirelessly with all of you until the day dawns when rape is recriminalised and it is pursued, so that there will never be testimony like Kat's again, because complainants will be getting justice.
Here. Thank you, Dame Vera Bird. I think we can all agree with your commitment there and the hope that that will one day be the case. I'd like to bring in Bonnie Turner, who is a victim and rape justice activist, to speak to us if she is on the Zoom call. Bonnie, if you are, can you indicate and let us know? No, I'm not sure if Bonnie is with us. If you are, highlight to me and we can bring you in at another point. But I'd like to get some questions, if I can, from the chat box from everybody who's been submitting them. Thank you all so much. You can do by popping them in the box. Just wanted to also read out this comment in the chat box. I'm not sure if you guys have seen, from Sarah Crew, who's the police lead for adult sexual offences. And she says, I am very happy to be held to account for improvement in this area. I am wholly committed to improving outcomes and experiences for victims and to bringing more perpetrators to justice. I know that this is a commitment shared by my NPCC colleagues and rape leads and police forces up and down the country. I completely support the recommendations on building specialism and expertise too, in policing alone, but also jointly with the CPS. This will be an important focus of the improvements we want to make. I have to leave now, but my commitment will continue. Thank you for the report and the invitations. Both are very powerful. And I just would like to thank Sarah. I know she's no longer on the call with us, but for her comments, which I know are greatly appreciated by all of us. Right, let's go to some questions. So we have one here for the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office from Emily, who says, we have heard how difficult survivor experiences of the justice system often are. How important do you think a guarantee of wraparound support during the investigation and trial process is? Who would like to come in? You, yeah, Amelia, yeah, come on in.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say I think it is it's vitally important, and I think within the sector and within government now there is a very strong commitment to ensuring that ISVA services are commissioned, and we've seen more of an interest in recent times in increasing funding to ISVA services, ISVAs being specialist advocates. But what we also really need to, I think, what we really need to gain is an understanding that at an independent specialist service, the survivor receives so much more than just support to court or support with the police. They can access specialist pretrial therapy. They can often access things like food bank vouchers, support with housing, support with so many different things, you know, attendance at a SARC or a GP appointment, where actually that survivor may need those different forms of advocacy in order to actually keep them within the criminal justice system. There's actually data from a couple of years ago, and I think it is around 25, I think there was a piece done in Essex which stated that actually survivors who had an ISVA were, I think, 25% more likely to stay within the criminal justice system. So it's evidence that it is actually really, really critical to have ISVA support. But we would say where that support is located is key. We know that that support is coming from rape crisis centres and specialist by and for services. That is different from a service that sits within the police or sits within a clinical service. So we'd say yes, wraparound, specialist, but independent support is absolutely critical.
Thanks, Amelia. Thank you. Samantha, one for you from Imkaan. Can you say more about how the racist, sexist myths and stereotypes play out when Black and minoritized women report rape?
Hi, just very quickly before, because I've got to shoot off, but it plays out in the ways in which women, victim survivors, are perceived probably by juries. It plays out in terms of at the point of disclosure, reporting to the police, perhaps, where certain some communities will be seen, you know, where Amelia had referenced before, sexual violence and rape might be seen as an extension, a part of someone's community, religion, culture, not seen as a form of violence. So there's a kind of normalization that happens, and there's also an invisibilization that happens where we have young women and girls, Black women and girls in the system who are not even seen as a survivor in the first place and may encounter certain levels of disbelief. So they're not even getting to that point where they are able to disclose. And I wanted to reaffirm what Amelia said around, that's why wraparound support is really important. We've done our own research at Imkaan with members that provide specialist support, and actually a lot of the survivors will access that support first, and with that support they probably will be supported to report to the police or disclose. So if you don't have that in the first place, the chances of women reporting to the police are kind of more reduced. Thank you. Sorry, there's a little rush because I've got to rush to another meeting.
Thank you very much for your contribution. We really appreciate it. Harriet, one for you, but also Wera, Ellie, if you wanted to jump in on any of these questions, please do. Harriet, if the police and prosecutors decide a woman's case won't stand up in court, isn't it because they are predicting jury prejudices in court? So aren't juries the real problem here? Do you think it's time that we stop using juries for this type of crime? Harriet, oh yeah, we need to unmute them.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, the problem is that many people acting in the criminal justice system seem to be infected by myths and stereotypes. And what the issue that we've been dealing with, particularly in our judicial review, is whether when police or prosecutors in particular are making decisions about whether to charge or not, they are thinking they have to make that on to pass the code for Crown prosecutors. They have to say, is it more likely than not that there would be the jury would convict? But they're supposed to do that not by thinking, well, this is the sort of case that a jury may find against the victim, the complainant, because she is not a sympathetic character, or this is a young, good-looking man, and juries aren't going to convict him. They'll think that he doesn't need to rape. So those sorts of myths and stereotypes are often within the system, and they often pervade decisions being made. And we have the merits-based approach has been designed to try to look at it objectively, like to ignore the myths and stereotypes and think, well, what is the evidence? You obviously can't bring every single case to court because some are going to be very fraught with difficulties, but we think you can bring a lot more cases. But do we need to change to juries? Well, that's one of our recommendations, is we think there should be a commission of inquiry to look into whether there are alternatives, whether there might be a different way of doing it, whilst not abandoning our whole criminal justice fair process. And we obviously throughout this report have in mind that defendants have rights as well, but it may simply be that there are certain types of cases. It's not just rape, but rape is probably the most rape and other forms of violence against women are the most affected by myths and stereotypes.
Thanks, Harriet. Wera, did you want to come in there? Yeah, she's on mute. We need to unmute you. Yay.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, I need to come back to actually what your report recommends, and that's very much a victim-centered approach across the board, and I think that's where it has to start. And of course, it needs, as it's also been said, a completely radical change of approach across the board, and that starts with the police. But actually, I think the police is probably the best, from my experience, in terms of responding to trauma, understanding victims and victim-centered services, more than I think the CPS and more and any other points of the criminal justice system. And therefore, I think it's definitely a good idea to also start with juries but also ultimately with judges, to be quite honest. And therefore, the testimony again and again of those who have survived rape and come forward and talk about it is so vitally important. But therefore, also the rape crisis centers are so important. Unless we allow women to recover from the trauma, they won't come forward and allow themselves to be re-traumatized, because whatever happens, it is a re-traumatizing experience. So, the support and this has to be across the board. And, where do you start? Well, I've said before, get the rape crisis centers in place. We just do not have enough. Start with a complete rethinking and different approach, and looking at victim-centered services, and look at trauma again and again. I keep saying that, trauma-informed services are so vital. But yeah, it is ultimately about the financial resources and support that the government is prepared to put into this. And it starts with rape crisis centres, of which we do not have enough.
Yeah, I completely agree. I recognise that we're running short on time. We could be here all afternoon, I think, asking some of these questions. It's so fascinating. One last question from the chat box. Having worked in the sexual violence sector for over 30 years, and I've seen many reports and reviews, how will we ensure that this one will make an impact? And also, how will we ensure that resources will be put in place for support for victims and survivors? I suppose enough rhetoric, more action, isn't it? Who would like to respond to that? Sarah, maybe I come to you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, you know, we end our report, if you flick to the end, with a very short assessment of the kind of 15 years of reviews, inquiries, independence, examinations of what's wrong with the justice system on rape. And we find a pattern where those reviews actually keep making very similar recommendations and opening by reflecting that, oh, these recommendations have been made before, but they've not been implemented, or there is analysis of why this is inherently quite difficult, but there are these measures we could take, and then they're not followed through with. And I could add by quoting the previous but one DPP, one Keir Starmer MP, who said in 2013, around the time that there was incredible national soul searching about children who'd been abused by groups and gangs, by the all of the revelations around Jimmy Savile and the high-profile men who had abused often girls and young women because their positions of power enabled them to do so. So incredible soul searching. And Keir Starmer said at the time, if all that we achieve in a set of guidelines which are jettisoned in 5 years because of more criticism, if that's all we do, we will have achieved nothing. And we will have let victims and indeed suspects down in a profound way. So a previous but one senior public servant in this area charged with improving justice here has already reflected that we know to some extent that we know what we need to do. We've got to see it through. We've got to have the political will, we've got to have the resource, and we've got to have the commitment to improving justice in this inherently difficult crime. So I think, you know, as we come towards the end of this year, a really, really difficult year for everybody, certainly for women who are at risk, for many who are on the call who work in the women's support sector. But as we look into next year, into 2021, when the ICSA inquiry might conclude or might produce some of its recommendations on, you know, around how the state let children down so badly and continuously enabled them to be abused again and again, I think this has to be time. And the answer is that we have to drive our political leaders to drive the change and tell them we insist on it, because this is a political issue. It's not, rape is not inevitable. It's not something that lives in an awkward social box in the corner. It deserves to be right up the top of the public policy agenda. And we need those who are elected to make that happen. And then we need those who, you know, have the privileged positions of being senior public servants in this area to demonstrate the curiosity needed to change it and to see through the change.
Thank you, Sarah. Before we finish, I'd like to read one of the comments out that we've had in from the Angelou Centre, the women's organisation, that says, we've discussed minoritized and marginalized women in categories. One of the issues is a lack of an integrated approach towards minoritized victims through an intersectional lens. How do we tackle this? As part of a consortium, a positive change partnership led by and for specialist organisations that are working with sexual violence victims who are excluded from mainstream services, we would question that the ISVA model and whether it is fit for purpose. If survivors are to be fully supported through a criminal justice system that is weighted against them, then we need support that is adequately funded, specialist and fit for purpose. And I think that pretty much says it all. All that's left for me to do today is to thank everybody for attending today's online event. It's been a fantastic session with an incredible panel of speakers. A huge thank you to all the organisations involved in drafting this report, the Centre for Women's Justice, End Violence Against Women Coalition, IMkaan, and the Rape Crisis England and Wales. And a huge thank you to all those involved in making this event happen today who've been working behind the scenes. We really couldn't have done it without you. Hopefully we can all get together soon when we have a government report to analyse and to question. And I really, really look forward to hopefully having this event in person as well when things get much, much better. But huge thank you. Diolch. Stay safe, everyone. And thank you for attending.